I remember the chill of that morning, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. The funeral flowers hadn't even wilted yet, and there I was, sitting in a conference room that felt more like a morgue than a place of justice. Long wooden table, white lights humming above, no coffee offered, not even a glass of water, just silence, sterile and sharp. Rebecca, my daughter-in-law, stood tall at the other end, her voice slicing through the air before anyone else spoke. She gets nothing, not a cent. Her words landed heavier than the coffin we lowered into the ground the day before. I sat frozen, my hands folded in my lap, feeling as though I had turned invisible overnight. No one handed me a packet. No one even looked my way. In that moment, I wasn't a widow. I wasn't a partner who had spent 43 years beside Patrick. I was nobody erased in one sentence. But then, the lawyer chuckled. Not kindly, not cruelly, but knowingly. That single laugh cracked the silence like lightning across a dark sky. My heart stuttered. Something was off. Something Rebecca hadn't planned for. And in that instant, I knew. This story wasn't finished. My name is Marianne Turner, and at 67 years old, I find myself looking back at a life that has been filled with love, sacrifice, and now, betrayal. When people look at me today, they may only see a small woman with silver hair cut neatly into a bob, a figure that does not draw much attention in a crowded room. But behind these lines on my face are decades of devotion, of building a life brick by brick beside the man I loved, and of believing in family with all my heart. For more than 43 years, I was Patrick's wife, his partner in every sense, and his caretaker when sickness threatened to take him away from me far too soon. Patrick and I met when I was just a young nurse in my 20s, fresh from training, still learning the rhythm of caring for patients. He was working in construction then, tall and broad-shouldered, with a smile that came slowly but lit up everything around him when it finally appeared. Our love story was not the kind people write songs about. There were no fireworks, no dizzying romance novels. Instead, it was something steadier, deeper, more enduring. It was like an oak tree planted firmly in the ground, growing stronger with every passing season. We built our life together in Salem, Oregon, in a house that became the center of our world. Patrick poured his sweat into its walls, hammering and painting long after the sun had gone down, while I planted the garden outside, arranging lilacs, roses, and tulips that would bloom each year as reminders of our growing love. The house was never just wood and brick. It was our creation, a breathing memory of every season we had survived together. Spring mornings filled with birdsong, summer evenings spent sipping iced tea on the porch, autumn days when the red and gold leaves gathered in piles that Patrick would rake while I teased him about missing a spot, and winters when snow blanketed the roof and the world outside grew silent. But the warmth between us never wavered. Patrick was steady, reliable, and deeply protective. He did not waste words, but his presence was enough to calm every storm in my heart. His hands, rough from years of work, could hold me with a gentleness that always surprised me. I learned early that love did not need to be loud or dramatic to be true. Ours was a partnership of small gestures, the way he always filled my car with gas so I would never worry, the way I packed his lunch every morning with a note tucked inside, the way we leaned on each other quietly, without needing to announce it to the world. Then cancer came. That word still makes my chest tighten. At first, it was just exhaustion. Then doctor visits, then tests, and finally, the truth we both dreaded. Patrick fought with a courage that humbled me, but as the months passed, the disease stole his strength. I became more than his wife. I became his nurse again, staying awake through long nights, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, holding his hand when he struggled to breathe. I spoon-fed him when he could no longer lift a fork, and when he was in pain, I whispered stories from our youth to remind him of better days. Those final months were cruel, yet they also revealed the depth of our bond. Even when his voice weakened, his eyes spoke to me, filled with messages I felt, but could not always decipher. There was something unspoken there, something I only began to understand after his passing. Rebecca entered our lives many years earlier. She was 38 when Patrick passed, but I met her when she was still in her 20s, freshly graduated, ambitious, already showing the sharp edges of a woman determined to conquer the legal world. Patrick adored her at first. He said she was clever, driven, a good match for our son, and I wanted to believe that too. The first time she visited our home, I prepared a meal with recipes from my own mother, and Rebecca complimented everything with a polished smile that made me think she truly meant it. I shared with her my recipes, my time, and even my secrets about balancing work and marriage. I thought she could be the daughter I never had. For years, I convinced myself she cared for me too, that when she called me for advice, it was from genuine respect. But slowly, distance grew. She became busier, colder, less inclined to sit in the garden with me or laugh at Patrick's jokes. She was polite, always polite, but behind her eyes there was calculation. I ignored it, told myself I was imagining things. I wanted so desperately for us to be a family, for my son's wife to be my daughter as well. I held on to that hope even when evidence suggested otherwise. When Patrick died, everything became clear. At the funeral, while friends and colleagues lined up to offer condolences, Rebecca stood near the casket, graceful and controlled, thanking each person as though she were hosting a professional event rather than mourning her father-in-law. She never once looked at me. Not when the hymns were sung, not when tears rolled down my cheeks, not even when I stood trembling beside Patrick's coffin. I was invisible, erased from the picture. After the service, a small box was pressed into my hands. Inside was only a tie clip. That was all. No note from Patrick, no last words, no acknowledgement of the decades we had shared. I stared at that cold piece of metal, trying to understand. The man who had promised me forever had left me with silence. My heart ached with an emptiness I cannot fully describe. It was as if someone had wiped away my existence with a single stroke. Then came the will reading. Rebecca arrived dressed impeccably, exuding authority as though she already knew the outcome. The lawyer began, and I sat quietly, waiting for Patrick's words, waiting for some sign that he had thought of me. Instead, I heard the unthinkable. The entire estate, every cent of the $52 million we had built together, was left to Rebecca. My name was not even mentioned. Not a single line acknowledged me. The woman who had stood by Patrick's side for more than 4 decades. The one who had managed our family trust with him for 20 years. Silence filled the room until one young associate hesitantly asked, "And Mrs. Turner's share?" Rebecca's lips curved into a smile that cut sharper than any blade. "There are no remaining distributions for her," she replied, her tone final, dismissive, as though I had never existed at all. My face burned, not just from humiliation but from the disbelief that Patrick could have done this. This was not the man I knew. Patrick would never abandon me, and that was when I realized something was wrong. The will, the silence, the missing pieces, it did not add up. Patrick had been leaving me messages, even when he could no longer speak. He always had his ways, tucking notes into books, scribbling reminders on scraps of paper, keeping trinkets in odd places. And as I searched, I found one. A fragment, a whisper of his voice beyond the grave. Rebecca thought she had erased me, but she had underestimated the bond between a husband and wife who had spent nearly half a century reading each other's every glance and silence. My grief began to transform. It did not disappear, but it hardened into resolve. I understood that I was not just a widow, discarded by her family. I was not a ghost. I was still here, and Patrick's truth was still here with me. This story was not finished, and if Rebecca thought she could write me out of it, She was about to discover just how wrong she was. A week after the funeral, when the grief had not even settled into something I could name, I found myself walking into Rebecca's office, a sleek corporate space with glass walls and polished floors that reflected light so harshly it felt as though it could cut through my skin. I had never belonged there, and that truth pressed against me as heavily as the black suit I still wore. Rebecca moved across the room with her usual confidence, her heels clicking like a metronome of authority, and I sat in a leather chair that seemed determined to swallow me whole. She was not grieving. No. Rebecca looked triumphant, her smile thin but steady, her eyes gleaming with the cold satisfaction of a woman who believed she had already won. She spread the papers out on her glass desk, aligning them neatly as though organizing proof of her victory. "The will has been finalized," she said, her tone clipped, professional, as if we were strangers conducting business. She did not call me mother, not even Mary Ann. To her, I was simply a formality she needed to handle. And then she delivered the sentence that landed heavier than any blow. "The estate, valued at $52 million, is now entirely mine." Her voice did not waver. She looked at me with the quiet arrogance of someone who expected no resistance, who believed I had neither the strength nor the will to fight. I wanted to scream, to shout that this was wrong, that Patrick would never have abandoned me, never have erased me with a single line on a document. Instead, I sat there, hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles turned white. The hum of the city outside the office felt far away, as though I had been locked in a glass box, trapped where no one could hear me. I forced myself to ask, "And what about my share? What about the trust Patrick and I built together?" But Rebecca's lips curled, her answer swift and merciless. "There are no remaining distributions for you." Her words rang in my ears long after I left her office, echoing like a cruel chorus. I walked out into the cool Oregon air, but even the breeze could not shake the feeling that I had been erased, not only from a document, but from the life I had lived. For 2 decades, I had sat beside Patrick at the kitchen table, balancing numbers, planning investments, ensuring that the family trust grew strong. Every dollar in that fortune carried fingerprints from both of us. And yet, with the stroke of a pen, my existence had been denied. The nights that followed were long, filled with restless hours staring at the ceiling, wondering if Patrick had truly done this to me. My heart refused to believe it. He had always been a man of loyalty, of fairness. Even in his weakest days, he had squeezed my hand, as though reminding me that I was still his anchor. He would not have left me with nothing. And then, one late evening, as I sat in the quiet of our house, the silence broken only by the creak of the wooden floorboards, I noticed a drawer left slightly ajar in Patrick's old desk. I opened it, expecting nothing, and found a folder buried under stacks of receipts. Inside, there was a draft of a will, handwritten, worn, with Patrick's signature at the bottom. My name was there. My future was there. But it had been crossed out, as though someone had tried to erase me with the weight of ink. My hands trembled as I held that paper. Patrick's handwriting was unmistakable, the loops of his letters familiar to me after decades of reading grocery lists and love notes. And yet, across the lines where he had provided for me, thick strokes of black pen had struck through my name, replacing it with Rebecca's. The discovery stole the breath from my lungs. I sank into Patrick's chair, clutching the draft as tears blurred the words. This was not an accident. This was deliberate. Someone had tampered with his wishes, reshaped his voice after he no longer had the strength to defend it. The more I thought, the more the pieces began to align in ways that sickened me. Rebecca had been in and out of our home constantly in those final weeks, carrying papers, whispering into her phone, keeping conversations out of my earshot. I had been too consumed with Patrick's care to question her presence. Now, looking back, I could see the shadow of manipulation everywhere. The witnesses listed on the final will were names I did not recognize. Not friends, not family, not anyone who had shared in Patrick's life. Strangers. And that fact burned through me like acid. Patrick had been surrounded by love, yet somehow his last document bore the signatures of people who had never known him. And there was more. Slowly, evidence surfaced like bones rising from the ground. Rebecca had begun selling items from our home even before Patrick passed. Paintings disappeared from the walls, furniture from the study, trinkets that Patrick had treasured for decades vanished without explanation. When I asked about them, Rebecca brushed it aside, telling me they were being appraised, or that Patrick had instructed her. Grief had blinded me then. I had accepted her words. But now the truth reared its head, sharp and undeniable. The final straw came at a tribute event for Patrick, organized by the foundation we had built together. The room was filled with colleagues, donors, and friends. People who had known us as a team, as partners, in building something lasting. Yet, as the speeches began, my name was never spoken. Rebecca took the stage, her voice strong, her presence commanding, and she spoke of Patrick as though she had been the one beside him for 43 years. I sat at the back of the room, hands folded in my lap, ignored, invisible. It was as though my decades with Patrick had been scrubbed from history, rewritten to make space for Rebecca's version of events. That night, something inside me shifted. I realized that silence was no longer an option. I could no longer sit quietly while my life, my love, and my husband's legacy were stolen from me. Rebecca believed she had buried me under her polished lies, but she did not know me as Patrick had known me. He had always said I was stronger than I believed, and in that moment, I decided he was right. I would not let her erase me. I would gather every shred of evidence, every whisper of truth, and I would fight. Patrick had left me more than memories. He had left me a hidden message, buried beneath Rebecca's deception, and I, Marianne Turner, would find it. The discovery of the handwritten draft kept me awake for nights, lying in the bed that still smelled faintly of Patrick's aftershave, clutching the paper as if it were a lifeline. I traced the loops of his handwriting over and over, whispering his name into the darkness. He had written me into his future, I was sure of it. He had wanted me taken care of, protected, remembered. But the bold black lines that crossed out my name screamed of interference. Someone had silenced him, and every instinct in my body told me that someone was Rebecca. I began searching through Patrick's things with a precision that surprised even me. Every drawer, every box in the attic, every envelope stuffed between bookshelves became a potential hiding place. I unearthed letters he had written to old friends, receipts from business dinners, and notes scribbled on the backs of envelopes. But what haunted me most were the inconsistencies I began to notice between his voice in those papers and the sterile coldness of the will Rebecca had presented. Patrick's handwriting in the draft was steady, though weaker than before, but the final version of the will bore no trace of his hand. The signatures, though meant to look authentic, carried strokes that seemed practiced, as though someone had imitated rather than created them. The witnesses troubled me most. I pored over their names in the documents. Not one of them was a family friend. Not one had stood by Patrick's bedside in those long final weeks. They were strangers, legal ghosts pulled into a moment that should have been sacred. I asked Rebecca about them once, carefully, trying not to reveal my suspicions. She brushed me off with that rehearsed smile of hers, the one that never reached her eyes. They were the only ones available at the time, she said lightly, as though explaining away a scheduling conflict. Her tone made it clear the conversation was over. But in my gut, I knew the truth. They were chosen because they would not question anything. As weeks passed, I noticed more signs of Rebecca's control slipping into every corner of my life. Items vanished from the house. A painting that Patrick had adored, one we bought during our 10th anniversary trip to Santa Fe, disappeared from the living room wall. A clock that had belonged to his father went missing from the mantel. When I asked, Rebecca told me they had been appraised or donated according to Patrick's wishes. But I had lived with Patrick long enough to know his wishes. He would never have let go of those things, not while he was still breathing. Each missing item was another piece of him being stripped away, as though Rebecca wanted to erase every trace of his existence, except the version she could control. And then there was the tribute event, the night I will never forget. It was meant to be a celebration of Patrick's life, organized through the foundation we had both poured our energy into. For 2 decades, we had worked side by side, raising money, meeting donors, writing letters of thanks. My name was printed on plaques, carved into stones at the garden we had created together. Yet on that night, as the lights dimmed and the podium shone beneath the spotlights, not a single mention was made of me. Rebecca took the stage, elegant in her black dress, her voice steady and commanding. She spoke of Patrick as if she had been the one beside him for 43 years, as if she had carried his burdens and shared his dreams. The audience applauded, unaware of the lie unfolding before them, and I sat in the back, invisible, my hands trembling in my lap. The silence that wrapped around my name was deafening. When the speeches ended, people came to shake Rebecca's hand, to congratulate her on the beautiful tribute. I slipped out quietly, walking alone under the cold Oregon night sky, feeling as though I had been buried alive beneath Rebecca's version of history. She had not only stolen Patrick's estate, she was stealing his legacy, rewriting the story of his life until there was no room left for me. But something inside me hardened that night. I realized that grief had made me quiet. But silence was not the same as surrender. I thought of Patrick's eyes in those final days, the unspoken words that had lingered there. He had trusted me to protect him, even when he no longer had the strength to speak. And if that meant standing against Rebecca, then I would. I began to document everything. I took photographs of the missing items, wrote down dates, gathered receipts. I revisited the handwritten draft of the will, comparing it with every piece of Patrick's handwriting I could find. Slowly, a pattern emerged: the slant of his letters, the shape of his signature, details that no forger could truly capture. Rebecca thought she had covered her tracks, but I knew her arrogance would be her undoing. Still, fear lingered. Rebecca was powerful, connected, and relentless. She moved through the world like a queen convinced of her divine right, and I was only a widow with shaking hands and fading strength. Yet I had something she did not: the truth. And the more I uncovered, the brighter it burned inside me. I started reaching out quietly to people who had been around Patrick during his final months. Nurses at the hospital remembered moments when Rebecca had insisted on handling paperwork alone, ushering them out of the room. A neighbor recalled seeing men carrying boxes from our house late at night. Little by little, whispers of suspicion began to form a chorus. The conflict was no longer just about money. It was about memory, about love, about the years I had spent giving everything to a man who deserved more than to have his story rewritten by greed. Rebecca had underestimated me, and in her arrogance, she had left cracks in the walls she built around her lies. My job now was to find those cracks, widen them, and let the truth pour through. For the first time since Patrick's death, I felt something other than despair. I felt purpose. The more I searched, the more the truth revealed itself, though each revelation felt like a knife twisting deeper into the wound Patrick's absence had left. One afternoon, as I sat at the dining table surrounded by piles of papers, I came across a notebook that had belonged to Rebecca's assistant. It had been left behind in a box of documents Rebecca must have overlooked when clearing the house. Flipping through it, I found scribbled notes about meetings, dates, reminders, nothing unusual at first. But then, on a page marked with a bright red tab, there it was, an entry that read, "Notarized Patrick's will did not see him sign." My breath caught in my throat. The date written beside the note was a day Patrick had been bedridden, unable even to lift a pen. The assistant had unknowingly provided proof that Rebecca had manipulated the entire process. I pressed the notebook to my chest, shaking. It was the first piece of concrete evidence, a spark in the darkness I had been wandering through. I knew then that Patrick had not abandoned me. He had trusted me, even in silence, to uncover the truth. But evidence alone was not enough. Rebecca was sharp, cunning, and she carried her lies like armor. I began reaching out cautiously, testing the waters. I spoke with a nurse who had cared for Patrick during his final hospital stay. With hesitant eyes, she admitted that Rebecca often demanded privacy when documents were signed, dismissing staff from the room. It felt wrong, she whispered, but she was his family, and I thought perhaps he wanted it that way. The guilt in her voice was heavy, and I wanted to comfort her. But all I could think was how Rebecca had weaponized trust, using it to isolate Patrick when he was most vulnerable. I started to feel the weight of isolation myself. Friends who once called after the funeral began to grow distant. Invitations to dinners or luncheons dwindled. Rebecca's influence stretched wide, and people feared aligning themselves with me might bring trouble. It was as if she had declared me an outcast, and the world around me had silently agreed. The loneliness was suffocating, yet within it burned a small, steady flame of defiance. Then came the day I found the letter. It was tucked inside a worn leather journal Patrick had kept on his bedside table. The handwriting was weaker, shakier than I remembered, but it was undeniably his. The letter was brief, only a few sentences, but they were enough to shift the ground beneath my feet. Marianne, if you find this, know that my trust lies with you. Do not believe what is placed before you. Protect what we built. Tears blurred my vision as I read those words again and again. It was as though Patrick was reaching out from beyond, guiding me, reminding me that love was stronger than deceit. I realized then that Rebecca had not only stolen material wealth, she had tried to rob me of my identity, of my place beside Patrick in the story of our lives. She wanted me erased, silenced, forgotten. But Patrick's letter was proof that he had seen her for who she truly was, even if he had been too weak to stop her. He had left me the torch, and I would carry it. My resolve hardened, but so did the challenges. One evening I returned home to find the locks changed. Rebecca claimed it was for security, that the estate now belonged to her. But I knew it was another attempt to push me out, to sever me from the home Patrick and I had built together. Standing on that porch, shivering in the cold twilight, I realized I had a choice: retreat into silence or stand and fight. And so, I called a lawyer. His name was Daniel, a man in his 40s with sharp eyes but a gentleness in his tone that reassured me. When I laid out the papers, the notebook, and finally Patrick's letter, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his lips. "This," he said slowly, "is more than enough to begin. But it will not be easy. Rebecca is clever, and she will not go down without a battle." I met his gaze steadily. "I don't want revenge," I whispered. "I just want the truth. I want Patrick's voice restored." Daniel agreed to help, and through him I met Lydia, a probate specialist who had seen more than her share of family betrayals. She studied the documents carefully, nodding, her expression tightening with each page. "Forgery, manipulation, coercion, it's all here," she murmured. "But we'll need witnesses willing to speak. That will make the difference." My heart sank, thinking of how many people had already turned away from me, but Lydia's determination gave me hope. Slowly, courage began to grow inside me, replacing the fear that had haunted me since Patrick's passing. I realized Rebecca's greatest weapon had been my silence, my grief, my willingness to believe that I was powerless. But I was not powerless. I was Patrick's wife. I was the woman who had stood by his side for more than 4 decades, who had built a life, a home, and a legacy with him. And I would not allow anyone, not even Rebecca, to erase that truth. The battle lines had been drawn, though Rebecca did not yet know it. She believed I was defeated, a widow too weak to rise. But in the quiet of my home, surrounded by the whispers of Patrick's presence, I was preparing. I was gathering the fragments of his truth, ready to piece them together into a weapon stronger than Rebecca's lies. And in my heart, I knew this was only the beginning. I remember the day hope returned to me, not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet knock on the door that changed everything. I had been sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the same papers I had shuffled for weeks. The evidence spread around me like broken pieces of a puzzle I was desperate to solve. The house was silent, heavy with the absence of Patrick. When the knock startled me, I opened the door to find Ava, Rebecca's assistant, standing nervously on the porch, her hands clutching a leather bag, her eyes darting as though she feared being followed. Ava had always been polite to me in passing, though she rarely stayed long enough for conversation. That day, however, she stepped inside quickly, almost urgently, and asked if we could talk in private. I led her to the dining room, the very place where Patrick and I had shared countless meals and conversations, and I offered her tea, though my own hands trembled. She refused politely, instead opening her bag and pulling out a small planner, her fingers hesitant, her voice trembling. "I don't know how long I can stay," she whispered, "but I can't keep this to myself anymore." I watched as she flipped to a page marked with neat handwriting, the date circled in red. She pushed it toward me, and my breath caught. It was the same date I had seen in her notes earlier, the day she had written that she notarized Patrick's will without seeing him sign it. Her eyes filled with shame as she explained. Rebecca had pressured her, asking her to notarize the document, even though Patrick had been bedridden, unable to hold a pen. She told me it was urgent, that Mr. Turner wanted it done but was too weak. She said I was helping the family, that it was only a formality. I didn't question her. Ava's voice cracked, her shoulders hunched under the weight of guilt. I felt a strange mixture of emotions flood through me: anger at Rebecca, compassion for Ava, and a fragile glimmer of hope that perhaps I was not as alone as I had believed. "You didn't know," I said softly, though my heart thundered. "You were manipulated, just like the rest of us." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. Then she pulled out her phone and showed me a series of messages from Rebecca, instructing her to prepare the documents, to arrange witnesses, to keep everything discreet. There were timestamps, threads, undeniable proof that the will had been orchestrated, not created by Patrick's hand. For the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of energy, as though Patrick himself was standing beside me, whispering, "Keep going, Marianne." Ava had risked everything to come to me, to tell the truth, and I could not let her courage be in vain. I called Daniel immediately, my lawyer, and within an hour, he and Lydia were seated at my dining table, poring over the planner and emails with sharp eyes and grim determination. Daniel leaned back, running a hand through his hair, his voice steady. "This changes everything. A direct witness admitting coercion. It's more than a crack in Rebecca's wall. It's the beginning of its collapse." Lydia added, her tone firm. "We need to secure Ava's statement officially, and we need to prepare for the storm that will follow. Rebecca will not take this quietly." I looked at Ava, her face pale but resolute, and I realized she was younger than I had thought, barely out of her 20s, yet carrying the burden of standing against a woman as ruthless as Rebecca. "Are you ready for that?" I asked her gently. She swallowed hard, then nodded. "I can't stay silent anymore. It's wrong. What she did to you, to him, it's wrong." Her words struck me deep, not because they were new, but because someone else was finally saying them aloud. For weeks, I had felt like a ghost screaming into the void, unheard, unseen. Now, at last, my voice was joined by another. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Daniel arranged meetings, Lydia drafted documents, Ava recorded her testimony. I spent hours going through Patrick's belongings again, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. I found small notes he had left in the margins of books, reminders of conversations we had had. One in particular stood out. In the corner of a gardening book, he had written, "M, the roses are yours. Don't let anyone take them." It was such a simple note, yet in it, I heard his voice, urging me to hold on not just to the flowers but to everything we had built together. Rebecca, of course, began to sense the shift. She showed up at the house unannounced one evening, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. She walked into the kitchen with her usual air of authority, her perfume sharp in the air. "I hear you've been meeting with lawyers," she said coolly, her eyes narrowing. I met her gaze without flinching. "I have." Her smile was tight, brittle. "You're wasting your time, Marianne. This is already settled. The estate is mine. Everyone knows that." I wanted to scream at her, to throw the evidence in her face, but instead I let the silence stretch until her smile faltered. Finally, I said, "We'll see." Her eyes flashed with anger, though she quickly masked it with a smirk. "You're going to embarrass yourself," she hissed before turning on her heel and leaving as abruptly as she had arrived. I stood there, my hands shaking, but inside me something had shifted. I was no longer afraid of her. That night, lying in bed, I thought of Patrick again. I remembered our first anniversary, when we had no money for gifts, so he built me a wooden jewelry box by hand. I remembered the way he held me after our son was born, whispering that I was the strongest woman he had ever known. And I remembered his eyes in those final days, full of a truth he could not voice. He had trusted me to fight, and now I finally understood how. The turning point had come. I was no longer the widow who sat quietly at the back of the room, invisible and erased. I was a woman armed with truth, with allies, and with the unshakable conviction that Patrick's legacy would not be stolen. Rebecca thought she had written the final chapter, but she was wrong. The story was still being written, and this time, I held the pen. The day of the foundation meeting arrived. A day I had both dreaded and anticipated with every fiber of my being. For weeks, Daniel and Lydia had prepared me, stacking evidence into neat envelopes, rehearsing what would be said, ensuring that every fact was airtight. Still, as I stood before the mirror that morning, fastening the small pearl earrings Patrick had given me on our 20th anniversary, my hands trembled. It was not fear of failure, it was the weight of carrying Patrick's truth, of stepping into a battlefield where the enemy wore the face of family. The boardroom was far grander than the lawyer's office, where this nightmare had begun. Long mahogany table, walls lined with portraits of donors, heavy curtains filtering the late morning light. I took a seat at the far end, my presence barely acknowledged. Rebecca sat near the head of the table, poised, immaculate in a tailored suit, her hair shining under the lights. She looked every bit the image of authority, the kind of woman who had already decided the outcome of the meeting. Her confidence radiated across the room, a silent declaration that she was untouchable. As the meeting began, Rebecca spoke with practiced eloquence, presenting herself as the natural heir to Patrick's legacy. She spoke of projects, of donations, of plans for the future, all while weaving herself into the center of the story. My name, once again, was absent. I listened in silence, my fists clenched beneath the table, until Daniel gave me the faintest nod. It was time. I stood slowly, my chair scraping softly against the polished floor. The room quieted, surprise flickering across faces that had not expected me to speak. Rebecca's eyes narrowed, irritation flashing for the briefest moment before she pasted on her perfect smile. "Marianne," she said smoothly, "I'm so glad you could join us, but I'm afraid this meeting is already underway." Her words were meant to dismiss me, to fold me back into the shadows. Instead, I stepped forward, my hands steady, as I slid a thick envelope across the table. "Then perhaps you should see this," I said, my voice quiet but unwavering. The board members glanced at one another, curiosity stirring. Rebecca did not move to open the envelope, so Daniel leaned forward, distributing copies to each person seated. Silence filled the room as pages were turned. Emails, planner notes, the testimony of Ava, the inconsistencies in signatures all laid out in black and white. I watched Rebecca's face carefully. At first, she maintained her composure, lips pressed into a thin line. But then her eyes caught a particular email chain, one she must have thought long buried, and for the first time I saw her mask falter. A flicker of panic crossed her features, so brief most would have missed it. But I knew. "You forged his will," I said softly, the words trembling not with doubt, but with the force of truth. "You manipulated witnesses, coerced your own assistant, and sold his belongings before he was even gone. You tried to erase me, but you cannot erase Patrick's truth." The air in the room shifted. Board members leaned back, their gazes turning from Rebecca to me. Lydia added calmly, "The evidence speaks for itself. Legal proceedings will follow, but this board deserves to know what has been attempted here." Rebecca's hands froze on the table, her perfectly manicured nails pressing against the wood. For once, she had no rehearsed response. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her voice lost somewhere between arrogance and fear. I almost pitied her in that moment, a woman so consumed by greed that she could not imagine the truth standing against her. Finally, she forced a laugh, brittle and hollow. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Hearsay and bitterness from a widow who cannot accept reality." Her voice rose, her control slipping. "Patrick chose me. He trusted me." But her words rang false, echoing off the walls like a lie shouted into an empty canyon. I did not raise my voice. I simply met her gaze and said, "Patrick trusted me for 43 years. And even in silence, he trusted me to protect him now." The room was silent, every eye fixed on us. I sat down slowly, my heart pounding, but I felt Patrick's presence beside me, steady and sure. For the first time since his death, I felt seen, heard, validated. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, Rebecca's armor had cracked. The chair of the board cleared his throat, his tone formal but uneasy. "Given the evidence presented, we will postpone the vote on new leadership until an internal review has been completed." It was not victory yet, but it was enough. Rebecca's face tightened, her knuckles white as she gripped the table. She did not look at me again. As the meeting adjourned, people filed out in hushed murmurs, their glances filled not with pity but with respect. Daniel squeezed my shoulder lightly, a silent reassurance. Rebecca gathered her papers with shaking hands and left without a word. I sat for a long while after, letting the silence wash over me, until finally I whispered, "We did it, Patrick. The truth is coming." The days following the foundation meeting moved like thunderclouds rolling across the horizon, heavy and electric, full of tension waiting to break. News of the confrontation spread quietly but steadily among the board members and donors. Some called me directly, their voices soft with apology, confessing that they had believed Rebecca without question, that they had thought me too fragile, too broken by grief to stand. Others avoided me altogether, ashamed perhaps of the ease with which they had erased me. I did not blame them. I had nearly erased myself. Rebecca, however, was not silent. She tried to regain her ground with fury disguised as dignity. She sent carefully worded statements to the board, insisting the accusations were false, painting me as a bitter widow lost in delusion. Yet every denial seemed weaker than the last. Every attempt at control chipped away by the documents Daniel and Lydia continued to gather. The investigation began officially within the week, and for the first time, Rebecca's power no longer felt absolute. I will never forget the moment I saw her unravel. It was at a second meeting called by the Foundation to discuss the evidence. She walked in with her usual polished appearance, but her eyes betrayed sleepless nights, shadows etched beneath the veneer of confidence. She carried folders, but her hands shook as she placed them on the table. She began to speak, her voice steady at first, but as Lydia presented Ava's sworn statement and played recordings of email confirmations, Rebecca's composure began to crumble. Her face flushed, her words faltered, and finally, she fell silent. I did not gloat. My heart ached as I watched her unravel, because in her I saw not just greed but desperation, the hollow core of someone who had built her worth on possessions and control. I thought of the years I had tried to love her as a daughter, the recipes shared, the afternoons in the garden, the laughter I once believed was real. It was difficult to reconcile that woman with the one now shrinking under the weight of her own lies. Yet pity could not erase what she had done. When the chair of the board announced that Rebecca's appointment was suspended, pending legal review, the sound of the gavel struck the table like a final chord. Rebecca gathered her papers with trembling fingers, her jaw clenched, and without looking at me, she walked out of the room. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, only retreat. The door closed behind her, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any applause. I sat still, my breath shallow, and then slowly exhaled. I did not feel triumph in that moment. I felt relief, sorrow, and above all, justice beginning to stir. Daniel leaned toward me, his voice quiet. "She's finished, Marianne. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but this is the beginning of her end." I nodded, though my eyes stung with tears. "I never wanted her end," I whispered. "I just wanted Patrick's truth." And that evening, I returned home to a house that felt different, lighter somehow, though the rooms were still filled with shadows of absence. I walked to the study, placed Patrick's letter on his desk, and whispered to the empty air, "We did it, love. We stood our ground." The words caught in my throat, but for the first time since his death, I felt peace settle gently over me like a blanket. The fallout in the weeks that followed was swift. Rebecca resigned from her position before the board could remove her formally. Donations that had once flowed through her dried up as donors pulled back, unwilling to be associated with scandal. Her name, once spoken with respect, became whispered with suspicion. I heard through quiet channels that she had moved out of the city, retreating into silence, much as she had once forced upon me. And what of me? I did not step into her place. I had no desire to claim leadership of the foundation, or to wield power. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was recognition of the truth. And that I received. At a luncheon held months later, a board member rose during his speech, his voice steady as he said, "We would not be here without Marianne Turner, whose dedication and partnership with Patrick laid the very foundation we now continue." The room turned toward me, not with pity but with respect, and for the first time in a long time, I felt visible again. That moment was not about wealth or status. It was about being acknowledged as part of Patrick's story, as part of his legacy. I did not need titles or power. I needed to know that the life we had built together could not be rewritten, could not be erased. Rebecca's downfall was never my goal. Justice was. Truth was. And though I carried sorrow in my heart for the daughter-in-law I had once hoped to love, I knew I had done what Patrick would have wanted. Silence may feel like surrender, but sometimes it is only the breath we take before speaking the truth. And when that truth finally finds its voice, it cannot be silenced again. When the storm had finally passed, what remained was not triumph but stillness. The quiet after a hurricane has stripped away the false walls and left only what is true. In those weeks after Rebecca's resignation, I found myself walking through familiar rooms that felt entirely different. The house in Salem, the one Patrick and I had built with our hands and our laughter, was still standing, though its walls carried the echoes of battle. Yet for the first time in many months, I could sit in the living room without feeling invisible. I could walk through the garden and see roses blooming not as remnants of loss, but as living proof that love endures. Life did not return to what it had been. How could it? Patrick was gone, and his absence would always be the shadow against which every light in my life would shine. But something else returned. Something I thought Rebecca had stolen forever. My place in his story. I no longer felt like a ghost wandering the edges of my own life. I was once again part of the legacy we had built. And that truth was acknowledged not only in documents and speeches, but in the hearts of those who had once doubted me. The foundation, once under Rebecca's control, moved forward with a renewed sense of integrity. I did not seek leadership. I had no hunger for titles or power. Instead, I accepted a role as advisor, not formal but respected, where my voice was welcomed and my history recognized. At one luncheon, I remember sitting quietly at the edge of a long table when a board member rose and said, "We owe so much to Marianne Turner, who alongside Patrick devoted decades to building this mission." The applause that followed was warm, genuine, and it washed over me like sunlight after a long winter. For the first time in what felt like years, I did not shrink back. I lifted my head, smiled through tears, and let myself be seen. Yet the resolution of this chapter was not only in public recognition, but in private healing. I spent hours in the study, reading Patrick's letters again, tracing the lines of his handwriting with my fingertips. I found comfort in the little notes he had left behind, mundane reminders that now felt like treasures. "Pick up bread," scribbled on a scrap of paper. "Call Jim about the roof," jotted in his neat script. Each note reminded me that love is not measured only in grand gestures, but in the ordinary acts that weave two lives together. I realized that Rebecca had tried to erase me by focusing only on wealth, on property, on possessions. But she had never understood the true inheritance. Patrick left me the memories, the devotion, the daily moments of shared life that no one could forge or steal. Sometimes I thought of Rebecca, of where she might have gone, of whether she felt regret as her empire of lies crumbled around her. There were days when anger flared, when I remembered the humiliation, the pain of being treated as if I had never existed. But more often now, I felt sorrow, not for myself, but for her. Because while I had lost Patrick, I still had his love, his truth, and his legacy. Rebecca had chased after money and control, but in the end, she was left with nothing, not wealth, not respect, not family. Perhaps that was punishment enough. Healing did not come all at once. There were nights when grief pressed heavy on my chest, when I reached across the bed expecting to feel Patrick's hand and instead touched only emptiness. But there were also mornings when I walked through the garden, saw the roses he had planted, and felt his presence in the dew on the petals, in the sunlight warming my face. Slowly, I began to believe that he was still with me in every breath, every memory, every truth I had fought to protect. One evening, I invited Ava to dinner, wanting to thank her not only for her courage but for reminding me that truth often depends on those willing to speak when silence is easier. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Patrick and I had shared so many meals, and we talked for hours. She confessed how much she had feared Rebecca, how close she had come to staying silent. I held her hand and told her that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand in spite of it. In her eyes, I saw the future, a younger generation, willing to fight for integrity, willing to learn from mistakes. It gave me hope that Patrick's legacy would not only survive but flourish. As months turned into a year, my life found a new rhythm. I joined a support group for widows, women who had also lost their partners after decades of shared lives. We sat in circles, telling stories, crying, laughing, holding each other and understanding that words alone could never fully capture. In their faces, I saw reflections of myself, women who had been underestimated, dismissed, erased, but who still carried within them a strength that no loss could take. Together, we reminded one another that love does not end when life does. I began writing as well, filling journals with memories of Patrick, not just the battles and betrayals, but the joys and the ordinary days. I wanted to leave behind a record, not for legal proof, not for recognition, but for myself, and perhaps someday for others. Writing helped me see that my story was never just about being betrayed by a daughter-in-law or fighting for an inheritance. It was about remembering that even when someone tries to erase you, your truth cannot be silenced if you choose to speak it. And so, resolution came not as a sudden victory, but as a steady unfolding, like dawn breaking after the longest night. I had not won wealth or titles, but I had reclaimed my place, my dignity, and my peace. I had honored Patrick by protecting his truth, and in doing so, I had honored myself as well. When I walk now through the halls of the foundation, my steps echo differently. They are no longer the footsteps of a ghost, but of a woman who has been tested and has endured. When I sit in my garden, I no longer feel like an outsider looking in, but as the keeper of memories that bloom in every flower, that whisper in every breeze. Patrick is still here with me, not in body, but in legacy, in love, in truth, and that is more than enough. When I look back now, through the pain and the battles, through the nights of loneliness and the days of confrontation, what remains is not the bitterness of betrayal, but the strength that came from refusing to be erased. I once believed silence was safety, that if I stayed quiet long enough, the world would remember who I was. But silence, I learned, is not surrender only when it is followed by truth. Speaking the truth, even when your voice shakes, even when you stand alone, is the bravest act of love you can give yourself. For so many months, I thought I had lost everything. My husband, my home, my place in the family, even my name in the legacy we had built. Rebecca tried to strip me of it all, believing that wealth and power could rewrite history. But what I discovered was this: you cannot erase love, you cannot erase truth, and you cannot erase the years that shape who you are. Patrick's trust in me, his love for me, and the life we built together could not be crossed out with a pen. They lived in my heart, in the memories we made, and in the courage he left me with. If you are listening to my story and you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever been pushed aside, if you have ever wondered if your voice mattered, let me tell you, it does. You are not a ghost. You are not a line that someone else can delete. You are the author of your own story, and no one can take that from you unless you let them. Rebecca's downfall was never about revenge. It was about restoring truth, about ensuring that the love of my life was remembered for who he was, and that I was remembered as the woman who stood beside him. And in fighting for that, I found something I never expected. I found myself again. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this: do not let anyone write you out of your own life. Do not let silence define you. Even the quietest voice can rewrite an ending. Even the smallest act of courage can change everything. And if my story has touched your heart, if it has reminded you of your own strength, I ask you to stay with me, to subscribe, to share, to continue supporting this channel, because stories like mine are not just about loss and betrayal. They are about healing, about truth, and about the quiet power that lives inside all of us. Together, we can make sure that no one is ever erased again.